Okay, so we are going to go ahead and look at Part B of Accentuate the Negative, Investigation 1.4. So Part B says that we should start with the original chipboard from question A, and that looks pretty darn close to the original chipboard from question A. And the very first question that it asks is describe 3 ways to get a total value of -2. Well, first, we got to figure out what our current total value is. So since this is 8 positives, those 8 positives are going to balance out with these 8 negatives. For each positive, every single negative that pairs up with it will create a value of 0, right? So if I add 1 and then take 1 away, I end up back to where I started. So I've made 0 progress. If I have $1, but I owe someone $1, then I don't really have any money because I'm going to take the dollar that I earned and give it to the person that I owe. So I don't have any money. So that's the pairing of a positive and a negative. So we're starting off right now with -4. So the first way that I'm going to describe a way how to get to a value of -2 is I'm just going to use a number sentence. So I'm starting off with -4. And if I go ahead and add 2 positives, so I'm going to take 2 positives to my board, that means those are going to counteract or pair up with those 2 negatives. And then that means I'm going to have a total value of -2, these 2 guys right here. So one option I could take is to add 2 to my total chipboard. So my chipboard was worth -4. If I add 2 to it, I will end up at -2. All right, another way that I can get there, again, if I'm starting off at -4. So I'm going to do a little bit of erasing here. Okay, starting off at -4. If I take away 2 negatives, I can also end up at -2. So if I take away this negative, and I take away or subtract that negative, I can also end up at -2. So if I subtract -2, I will also end up at a total value of -2. Now, we're going to see how what we see on the left and what we see on the right are related here. The third way I can get a value of -2, go ahead and put these back, is I could do a combination. I could take away 1 negative and add in 1 positive. So then this positive and this negative would counteract each other, and I would end up with -2. So if I start with -4 and I add 1 positive and then take away 1 negative, I will also end up at -2. Now, what we're going to learn as we go further into this investigation is that all 3 of these are actually representations of the same thing. So if I look here, but we saw that we manipulated the chipboard differently. We're able to take away negatives and add positives to change value. But what we're going to learn is that here, when you subtract a negative, it is the same as adding a positive. And we're going to start making a connection to that relationship. So if we make something less negative, we're actually pushing it in the positive direction. So I want you to think of a spring that has a weight that's being pulled down, making that string longer. So there's a weight at the bottom of the spring. That is a negative value, right? It's pulling that string down. If we take that weight away, I keep saying string, I mean spring. If we take that weight away, the spring will go in the upwards or positive direction. I think I'm talking as if you can see me, and yeah, I'm not sure that's going to work. So I want you to imagine a spring here in the middle, and there is a weight down here at the bottom. This would be a huge negative. Now, if we were to somehow take that away, the spring would go in a positive direction. So we're going to notice mathematically, when we subtract negatives, our value goes in a positive direction. -2 is more positive than -4. All right, so how are these two related to the last one here? Well, if we use that same logic that subtracting a negative is like adding a positive, then basically we're adding 1 twice. And if we're adding 1 twice, that's the same thing as adding 2. All right, so that's a long explanation. I'm going to make the other ones a little bit quicker because we do have other questions we need to answer here. We need to describe 3 ways to get a total value of 0. So it's going to take a lot of erasing. 3 ways to get a total value of 0. We need to put this back here. Okay, that's our original chipboard at -4, -4. So if we want to get to 0, I can take away these 4 negatives off the board. Come on. Took away the 4 negatives. So I could subtract 4 negatives. Okay, so I'm subtracting 4 negatives. And that will get me to 0. All of the positives on the board cancel out all of the negatives on the board, and we have a total value of 0. That is one way I can do it. I can also put those 4 negatives back, starting over again. I can also add 4 positives, and those 4 positives will counteract the negatives that are there, which means that we started off at a -4, and then we added a +4. That also gets us to 0. Hopefully you're starting to see the pattern. Okay, this is our original board. Now, another way I could get to 0 is I could take away 2 negatives and add 2 positives. Now everything on the board cancels out. So I started out with -4. I added 2 positives, then I subtracted 2 negatives, and that also gets me to 0. Again, if we start to recognize that subtracting 2 negatives is the same as adding 2 positives, we'll see how -4 plus 4 is 0. So -4 plus 4, when we add 2 opposites together, we end up at 0. All right, -4 is the opposite of +4. +4 is the opposite of -4. When we add 2 opposites together, we end up with 0. This is a really important concept to understand as you move into algebra in 8th grade and high school. 2 more to go. Describe, I think maybe just 1 more to go. Yep, just 1 more to go. Describe 3 ways to get a total value of -4. Well, this is going to be interesting because we already start off at -4. We're already starting off at -4. So that's our original board. We're already at -4. So how do we stay at -4? Okay. Well, we know we're going to be adding 0, right? So in order to add 0 to our board, we have to add pairs of positives and negatives. So if I add 1 positive and 1 negative, well, that positive and negative are going to cancel each other out, and we'll stay at -4. So if I add 1 positive and I add 1 negative, we still end up at -4. So I want you to think about this. I'm at -4. I go up to -3. I take away one of those, or I add another negative. Sorry, let's start over. I'm at -4. I go up 1 positive. So now I'm at -3. Then I go down a negative. So I'm adding a negative value. So I go back down and I'm at -4. And basically we can do that with any pair. So instead of just adding 1 of each, I'm going to add 2 of each. And the same thing happens. They cancel each other out. -4 plus 2 positives plus 2 negatives, because I added more negatives. then I still end up at -4. So -4 up 2, and then down 2, we end up right back at -4. So I'll go ahead and do the last one for you. Hopefully you see this coming. I added one more positive and one more negative. They cancel each other out. I'm still at -4. So if I take -4 plus a +3 plus a -3, I still end up at -4. Back to where I started. Started at -4, moved up 3, then added 3 in the downward direction, and up right back where I started. 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, back where you started. Okay, so that is part B. We're going to get this done one part at a time. Don't forget, we're going to turn in the whole assignment all at one time at the end of all, I think, 6 parts. So again, hope this was helpful. Send me a question in Google Classroom if you have one.